In the Norman hedgerow country, far from the glamour of flags and speeches, war was often heard before it was seen. A German command post sat in a low farmhouse whose windows had been darkened with blankets, its walls crowded by maps that tried to make order out of lanes, ditches, and green walls of brush. On a crude table, a field telephone was connected to the front by wire that ran like a nerve through damp earth. When it rang, the voices that came through were never speeches, only fragments. A platoon leader counting breaths, a runner relaying a message he did not fully understand, a man whispering coordinates as if loudness could draw artillery. The officers listened in the way men listen when they know the sound itself is information. A pause meant a unit was moving. A sudden rush of words meant a position was breaking. Behind every syllable was the same background: hurried breathing, the scrape of boots, the distant percussion of guns that did not care which language was spoken above them. War reduced itself to cadence, fast or slow, steady or panicked, and the wire carried that cadence into the room like a contagion. Then the door opened, and the rhythm shifted. A liaison officer entered with mud on his trousers, and a look that suggested he had run too far for too small a message. He did not deliver a formal report. He delivered a rumor, the kind that outruns vehicles and arrives ahead of evidence. "Patton is in the area," he said. "Not a division, not a corps, a name." In the German army's late war experience, names could be more dangerous than numbers, because numbers could be counted. A name could mean anything. The room changed temperature without anyone touching the stove. Maps that had seemed accurate a minute earlier now felt like portraits of a past that was already ending. Timetables, carefully drawn withdrawals, bridge demolitions, supply movements, looked suddenly dishonest, as if the paper itself had promised more time than time was willing to give. Men who had spent years learning how to make retreat orderly began to sense that order was about to be denied. One colonel, grey-faced and precise, held a pencil over the map and pressed down as he thought. The pencil did not snap at first. It splintered slowly, wood cracking under a hand that was not trying to break anything. It was the smallest kind of violence, and it said more than any shouted command. He understood what the rumor implied. Not merely a battle, but the beginning of a collapse in sequence, hold, disengage, reform, turned into something else entirely. Someone asked the practical question every staff must ask: where? Where exactly is he? The liaison officer did not answer, because Patton was rarely a dot you could pin. He was motion, and motion defied neat location. In the logic of the German staff system, a threat became manageable when it could be plotted. But how did you plot a tempo? Outside, the sky carried the steady drone of Allied aircraft, a mechanical reminder that the enemy could see roads, bridges, and columns from above. Inside, the commanders felt their margin for error compressing, not to hours, but to minutes. They were not afraid of a particular weapon in that moment. They were afraid of a pace, of a war that, once it accelerated, would not wait for permission to destroy them. And if that rumor was true, the question was no longer what the Americans had in front of them. It was how long Germany could keep thinking before thinking became too slow to matter. By the summer of 1944, George S. Patton's reputation had begun to operate like a weapon system. Not because it destroyed tanks at long range, but because it reached into enemy headquarters and altered the way time felt. Air power could flatten a rail yard and make logistics impossible. Patton's name did something quieter and, in its way, just as decisive. It compressed decision space. It made commanders act before they were ready, commit before they were certain, and retreat before they had even admitted they were losing. German officers did not need to see his armored columns to feel the pressure. They feared the speed at which their own assumptions stopped being true. A road thought safe at dawn could be cut by noon. A flank judged stable could become an opening without warning. In a war where their resources were thinning and their room to improvise was shrinking, the most dangerous thing was not a heavy blow. It was a sudden change in the conditions that made their plans coherent. Inside staff rooms, that fear became visible in small, almost clerical movements. A staff officer leaned over the situation map and moved a marker a few kilometers west. He wrote a note in neat script. Then a new message arrived, and he moved the marker again before the ink on the first correction had dried. The map was supposed to be a controlled representation of the battlefield. Under the weight of Patton's tempo, it began to look like a confession, proof that the rear was always learning too late. This was the late-war reality in Europe. Bravery still mattered, but it was no longer the decisive resource. The decisive resource was reaction. It was the ability to absorb bad news, translate it into orders, and execute those orders before the ground changed again. German command culture, built on staffs, timetables, and carefully staged withdrawals, depended on the battlefield remaining legible for long enough to manage it. Patton threatened legibility itself. He did it through a particular habit of war. Reconnaissance for many armies was a separate phase, a careful look before a careful move. For Patton, reconnaissance was often the opening of the attack. If scouts found weakness, he did not pause to admire it. He pushed through, and what began as a probe became a penetration. Then penetration became pursuit, and pursuit became the kind of rolling pressure that prevents an enemy from ever restoring shape. A unit that might have disengaged cleanly against a slower opponent found itself chased while still reorganizing, struck while still packing its radios, and pushed again before its commander could even understand the last blow. That is why the fear was professional, not mythical. German commanders were not frightened by superstition. They were frightened by sequence. Patton disrupted the order by which an army saves itself, hold, withdraw, reform, counterattack, by denying the pauses that make each step possible. And so the question sharpened inside those rooms where telephones rang and maps grew messy. What exactly did German commanders believe Patton could do that other Allied generals could not? And what would that belief force them to do next? The fear surrounding Patton ran deeper than the sound of his engines. In 1944, German commanders sometimes behaved as if he were present, even when he was not. They shifted reserves, delayed withdrawals, and stiffened entire sectors of their front on the suspicion of his approach, responding to a possibility as if it were already a fact. It was an unusual kind of pressure, the kind that does not require contact. It simply requires belief. This was the strange fusion of deception and expectation that marked the war's middle and late phases. Allied planners understood that in modern conflict, information is terrain. They also understood that Patton's name had become terrain inside the German mind, an internal landscape of dread and calculation. A rumor could travel faster than a tracked vehicle. A single intercepted message, a single mistaken sighting, could make a commander behave as though an armored spearhead was already carving a road through his rear areas. In German intelligence files, this turned into a clerical ritual. An officer drafted a summary in sober language, enemy concentrations, supply status, likely intentions, and then paused when he reached one word. Patton. He underlined it, then marked it again, and finally highlighted it like a warning label, as if ink could slow down a man who measured war in miles per day. On paper, it looked procedural. In practice, it was fear trying to disguise itself as analysis. There was a moral irony in this, and it deserves to be said plainly. Reputation is built by violence, by the visible ruin left behind when a commander moves too quickly for his enemy to recover. But once built, reputation can be weaponized without firing a shot. It can make an opponent waste strength, guard empty roads, and hesitate at the wrong moment. In that sense, Patton's legend became an extension of Allied power, operating even when his actual units were elsewhere. German commanders began guarding against a spear that might never strike because the consequences of being wrong were catastrophic. If Patton appeared where you had not prepared, he could turn a controlled withdrawal into a broken retreat. He could take the time you needed for demolition, regrouping and resupply, and spend it before you realized it had been taken. So they held back divisions, not to meet him with certainty, but to protect themselves from the shameful sentence of late-war command. too late. This is where the shock truly lands. Patton became not just a general, but a hypothesis, an assumption that shaped decisions in advance of evidence, and Germany, already bleeding resources, could not afford to test that hypothesis the hard way. To understand how a man becomes a shadow army, we have to rewind to the beliefs that made it possible. Patton's almost religious faith in speed, and Germany's growing fear that a rapid collapse could happen faster than any order could be written. To understand why Patton's name carried such weight, it is not enough to list his victories. One has to understand the belief that governed his decisions, because belief is what turns a commander into a consistent threat. Patton's philosophy was a kind of ruthless arithmetic. Every hour spent waiting meant more shells falling on infantry who could not move. Every day spent debating meant another convoy destroyed, another bridge repaired by the enemy, another defensive line made stronger by the simple passage of time. In his mind, delay created casualties. Momentum, by ending fights sooner, could save lives, at least the lives of those who survived the acceleration. He treated war as movement first and destruction second. An enemy army, he believed, was not a stone wall. It was a living structure held together by communications, confidence, and routine. Cohesion was fragile, and once it cracked, it could be widened. His mission was to never let that structure settle into balance. A German unit that dug in, reorganized, and restored its chain of command became something stable. Patton's goal was to keep it unstable, marching, reversing, improvising, until exhaustion did what explosives could not. This belief expressed itself in the way he spoke and the way he looked at maps. There is a particular image, repeated in accounts from his staff. Patton leaning over a map table, not discussing objectives in abstract terms, but in miles and hours. 10 miles by nightfall, 20 tomorrow. He made distance sound like morality, as if movement itself were a form of righteousness. Where another commander might say, "We will secure the line," Patton would say, "We will be at that river." His language did not describe war, it described velocity. But his obsession with speed was not merely personal temperament. He tried to build it into machinery. He trained staffs to think like engines: fuel, routes, repair schedules, bridge loads, radio discipline. He demanded clear orders and clean communications because confusion was a mechanical failure, and mechanical failures killed tempo. In a modern army, speed is not simply how fast tanks can drive. It is how fast a headquarters can process reality and push decisions forward. Patton's headquarters was meant to do that without hesitation, like a motor that never sputtered. This was where brilliance met hazard. Patton believed audacity could be a form of care. If you struck hard and moved fast, you spared your men the slow bleeding of a prolonged front. Yet he also believed caution was a form of waste of time, waste of opportunity, waste of the enemy's moment of weakness. That conviction could produce decisive breakthroughs. It could also produce overreach, exposed flanks, and the quiet cruelty of expecting exhausted soldiers to do what their bodies could barely endure. The moral tension sits here, at the center of his doctrine. When a man worships momentum, he risks turning people into numbers on a timetable. Miles per day becomes more than a metric. It becomes a judgment. Units become slow or fast, and the reasons for slowness, mud, loss, fear, wounds, can disappear behind the demand to keep moving. Patton's arithmetic, for all its strategic logic, carried a human cost that could not always be calculated in advance. And this is what made him so frightening to an enemy that depended on time. German command culture, especially by 1944, relied on orderly withdrawals and timed defenses: hold long enough, disengage cleanly, reform on the next line, then counterattack if the conditions allowed. Their system required pauses. Patton's system was designed to deny pauses. The two beliefs were about to collide, not as a clash of personalities, but as a clash of mechanisms. And the side that controlled time would determine whether a retreat remained an operation or became a rout. By 1944, Many German commanders in the West were no longer fighting for grand victory. They were fighting for coherence. The war had become smaller around them, not in violence, but in options. Fuel was scarce, air cover unreliable, replacements thin. Under those conditions, survival depended less on heroic counterattacks than on the ability to make defeat orderly. If a front had to bend, it had to bend in a controlled arc, not shatter into pieces. This is why German command in the late war developed a professional discipline of retreat. It was not cowardice. It was a method, staging withdrawals in layers, buying hours and days so the next line could be formed before the enemy arrived. A good retreat was a kind of engineering. You held with one unit while another moved. You disengaged before encirclement. You reassembled just far enough back to restore command and supply. In a war of attrition, the side that could retreat without collapsing could often fight again. Their doctrine relied on sequence, and sequence relied on time. Hold, disengage, move, reorganize, counterattack if possible. The order mattered. If a unit tried to move before it disengaged, it became a column exposed on roads. If it tried to disengage without a place to reorganize, it became a crowd. And if it counterattacked without recovering, it became a brief flare of courage that burned itself out. German staffs, trained for method, tried to make the battlefield legible enough for that sequence to work. In headquarters rooms that smelled of cigarettes and damp wool, the war often became mathematics. A staff officer bent over a table, not with a rifle but with a pencil and a set of distances. He calculated bridge demolitions, how long to place charges, how much time to evacuate the engineers, how many minutes to detonate after the last vehicle crossed. He calculated rail movements, how many trains could still run at night without being broken by air attack, how long it would take to move a battalion from one sector to another before the roads clogged with refugees and retreating units. He was trying, in a sense, to turn geography into mercy, to make rivers and roads buy time for men who could not buy it themselves. Against a cautious opponent, this system could work. If the enemy paused to consolidate gains, if he waited for supplies, if he respected the phases of an operation, the retreating force could recover its shape. Time was the currency that made retreat coherent. A few hours could mean the difference between forming a defensive line and being hit while still unpacking radios. A single night could allow a battered unit to find its officers again, distribute ammunition, and restore the simple belief that command still meant something. Patton's approach attacked time itself. He did not merely win ground. He tried to erase the interval between defeat and escape. When he pressed hard, the German sequence began to collapse. Units that expected to disengage found themselves pursued before they could withdraw. Units that expected to reorganize found their assembly points already threatened. The safe space behind the front, the space where an army becomes itself again, shrunk until it was only a road under aircraft and artillery. In that condition, doctrine becomes aspiration, not reality. There is an irony here that the German commanders could feel even if they did not speak it aloud. Their strategy was built on delay, yet it became helpless against a commander who refused to grant delay. They needed time to save themselves. Patton's entire system was designed to make time unavailable. And this is where reputation is forged. Not in speeches, not in slogans, not even in the headlines back home, but in relentless pursuit across real roads, where men learn that the next line is never ready, and the enemy behind them is moving faster than their own orders can travel. The German doctrine of survival was about to meet a war that moved like an engine, and the first thing it would lose was its timetable. Long before Patton's name became a pressure point inside German headquarters in France, it had already begun to harden into something recognizable on the Mediterranean's dusty roads. Sicily in 1943 was not the largest campaign of the war, but it was an early laboratory for tempo, an island where distance was limited, where movements were visible, and where a commander's personality could imprint itself on an entire operation. For Patton, it became an opportunity to prove that speed was not a slogan. It was a method. The terrain and the heat did not invite elegance. Roads were narrow, villages crowded. dust thick enough to coat faces and rifle bolts. Yet Patton pushed columns forward with a hunger to outpace expectations, his own, his rivals, and the enemy's. He drove hard marches, improvised routes when the obvious roads were blocked, and treated hesitation as a kind of defeat. In the American ranks, the pace produced a mixture of pride and fatigue. Men could feel the war moving under their boots, and movement felt like purpose. But movement also meant exhaustion, and exhaustion is a quiet enemy that does not announce itself. Sicily also exposed what would always travel alongside Patton's brilliance, the hazard of ego. He wanted to be first, to be seen, to be undeniable. That desire could generate decisive action. It could also court disaster. Patton's intensity demanded discipline, and his discipline could become cruel when it met human limits. The campaign carried moments that complicated the mythology, moments that suggested speed could be achieved not only through inspiration, but through pressure so relentless it left little room for fragility. On a roadside, a soldier watched one of Patton's columns surge past. Tanks, half-tracks, trucks packed with men and ammunition, all moving like a single organism. The soldier felt the surge in his chest, the way one feels a storm's approach. A sense of power, a sense of inevitability. It was inspiring because it implied the war could be directed, shaped, forced forward. It was also exhausting, because it implied that stopping was not part of the plan. In that moment, the tempo itself became a kind of atmosphere, something you breathed, something you could not easily refuse. The enemy, of course, watched as well. Even in Sicily, where German forces were not the dominant presence everywhere on the island, German officers took notes on patterns. Armies do not only remember what happened, they remember how it happened. A fast commander creates fast disasters for those who hesitate. If your system relies on orderly withdrawal, you cannot afford to be surprised by a man who turns every pause into a trap. Sicily offered the first clear evidence that Patton's instinct was to convert opportunity into motion before the opponent could name what was happening. German officers began filing him away as a type, restless, aggressive, difficult to predict. The kind of commander who would not wait for a perfect plan when a good enough plan could keep the enemy off balance. They had seen such commanders before, sometimes in their own ranks earlier in the war. But now they saw the pattern forming on the Allied side, backed by growing resources and widening air superiority. Meanwhile, Patton's legend became useful and dangerous at the same time. It was a tool for Allied morale, a story of drive and decisiveness that American newspapers could understand. But it was also a problem for Allied command, because legend invites rivalry. It creates political currents inside an army, questions of credit, of glory, of who is trusted with the main effort. Patton was not just a general moving across an island. He was a personality producing consequences at every level. Sicily, then, was not the moment German commanders became terrified. It was the moment the conditions for that terror were established. The island taught the enemy what Patton valued, and it taught Patton what speed could do to an opponent's sense of control. But the decisive fear, the kind that changes decisions before battles begin, would be born later on the roads of France, where speed would no longer be measured in ambition, but in operational collapse. For weeks after the landings in Normandy, the landscape itself seemed designed to slow an army's thoughts. The hedgerows were not simply vegetation. They were walls, thick, rooted embankments crowned with tangled green, each one a miniature fortress that broke up sightlines and trapped movement into narrow lanes. In that country, war became close and granular, measured in yards, not miles. But when the breakout came, it felt like a physical law had been repealed. The hedgerows gave way, the front loosened, and suddenly the continent opened into space again, space that could be exploited, space that could be squandered, space that Patton would treat as currency. On the macro scale, the transformation was immediate and unsettling. Where German commanders had grown used to predicting Allied progress in careful increments, Patton's forces began to drive hard into gaps faster than headquarters could name them. A town taken in the morning became a crossroads secured by afternoon. A road that seemed secondary on a map became, under pressure, the only route left for a retreating unit. The speed was not merely tactical, it was psychological. It made the battlefield feel as if it was sliding away from the people trying to control it. For the men on the ground, the disorientation appeared in brief, sharp moments. A German battalion commander, tired, competent, responsible for hundreds of lives, received an order to hold his position. The order carried the usual language of firmness, as if firmness could change material facts. Soon after, a second order arrived: withdraw to a new line. Then, before the withdrawal could be organized, there was nothing. No further guidance, no confirmation, only the sound of distant engines and the increasing certainty that the new line existed only on paper. In the gap between orders, command became a rumor. And in modern war, rumor is a poor substitute for control. This is where Patton's system begins to show itself, not as personality, but as method. His tempo was radio-driven. It relied on a nervous system of communications that pushed intent forward faster than a traditional chain of written orders could manage. Units were expected to move on incomplete information, to treat contact with the enemy not as a reason to stop, but as a reason to decide faster. Reconnaissance was not a polite scouting mission. It was aggressive, probing, designed to find the softest point and immediately convert that knowledge into movement. The pressure focused on the places that make an army function: road junctions, bridges, and the subtle geometry of crossroads. A retreating force can survive a setback if it can move as a unit. It can reorganize if it can funnel through predictable routes. Patton's pursuit sought to break that predictability. His columns did not always aim for the most heavily defended position. They aimed for the places that would force the enemy to choose, left or right, north or south, and then punish whichever choice came too late. Every 2 or 3 days, German staffs learned a new kind of tension. It was not the fear of being surrounded in the classic sense, the fear of a clean encirclement line drawn in red pencil. It was something more chaotic: fragmentation. Under Patton's pressure, units did not merely retreat, they began to separate. A regiment became a collection of stragglers and vehicles. A division became scattered battalions trying to find each other across roads swept by aircraft. An army that cannot move together begins to think in pieces, and when it thinks in pieces, it fights in pieces. The revelation for German commanders was blunt. Patton did not simply defeat formations. He disorganized the logic by which formations escape. The old doctrine, hold, disengage, move, reorganize, requires intervals. It requires the space between defeat and pursuit. Patton tried to erase that interval. He attacked the act of withdrawing itself, turning what should have been a controlled movement into a series of urgent improvisations under pressure. In that environment, even a well-trained staff can lose its grip on reality, because reality is changing faster than it can be reported. In the countryside, the chase left physical evidence. Columns abandoned vehicles when fuel ran out or when roads jammed. Units detonated their own equipment to prevent capture. Bridges were blown not according to plan but in panic, sometimes too early, trapping friendly forces on the wrong side. Civilians watched the flow of men and machines as if watching a river that had broken its banks, carrying away not only material, but the idea of order. And the Germans understood something else, something colder. Against Patton, the safest choice, waiting for certainty, became the deadliest. In most military systems, caution is rewarded. You verify, you confirm, you align your forces before committing. But Patton's tempo punished verification, because by the time certainty arrived, it arrived too late. A commander who waited for a complete picture often discovered that the picture had already changed, and the only remaining choices were worse than the ones he had postponed. This is why the rumor of Patton in the area had teeth. It did not promise a single blow. It promised a chase, one that would make every delay expensive, every pause dangerous, every map obsolete before it could be trusted. And as German headquarters searched for a way to slow the American engine, they began to realize that even the fastest pursuit has one vulnerability: Because no matter how aggressive a commander is, no matter how sharp his instinct for movement, an army still runs on fuel. And sooner or later, even the most relentless chase must confront the physics of supply. After the breakout, the war in France seemed to move the way a flood moves, fast, sprawling, indifferent to the neat boundaries drawn on maps. Patton's columns poured through openings and kept going, pressing into the depth that German planners had once assumed could be defended in stages. But even floods obey certain limits. An army can only be as fast as the fuel in its tanks, the rubber on its wheels, and the weight a bridge can carry without collapsing into a river. For all of Patton's obsession with momentum, there was an invisible leash attached to every mile he gained. This is the part of war that rarely appears in heroic narratives, yet it decides campaigns with a quiet finality. Logistics is not merely support, it is the bloodstream of movement. A modern mechanized army consumes fuel with the same certainty that an artillery barrage consumes shells. When the front races ahead, supply lines stretch behind it like strained rope. Trucks run longer routes. Roads degrade under constant traffic. Maintenance schedules become negotiable, and the price of negotiating with machines is breakdown. The macro picture in late summer 1944 was a lesson in geography and arithmetic. Ports and depots dictated how far brilliance could travel. Normandy's beaches could deliver an immense flow of men and material, but the deeper the Allies advanced, the farther that material had to go by road. Rail networks were damaged, bridges were scarce, fuel had to compete with ammunition, food, and spare parts for space on trucks. Even victory creates its own demand. Liberated towns needed supplies, refugees filled roads, and every additional division at the front meant another appetite that could not be ignored. Patton's Third Army felt this constraint in the most personal way possible: stillness. In a field somewhere in France, a tank crew sat beside their vehicle, the metal cooling under a grey sky. They could hear distant guns, could see the occasional Allied aircraft crossing overhead, and could read the tension in the faces of passing messengers. But their own machine did not move. Not because it was broken, not because the enemy had stopped them, but because the fuel simply was not there. The crew's frustration was not theatrical. It was practical. A tank that does not move is not armor. It is a parked piece of steel waiting to be found. For German commanders, this pause produced a brief, cautious relief. It was proof that Patton could be slowed by physics, if not by bullets. Their staffs had been battered by the tempo of pursuit, their withdrawals made ragged by the speed of American columns. Now, for a moment, the pressure eased. Orders could be written without immediately becoming obsolete. Units could attempt to reconnect with one another. Bridges could be prepared. Defensive lines, thin, improvised, but still lines, might be established before the next blow arrived. In war, a pause feels like mercy, even when it is only a logistical accident. But Patton did not treat supply as an external limitation to accept. He treated it as another battlefield, and he fought for it with the same intensity he fought for ground. Speed became a bureaucratic battle, one waged in conferences, radio calls, and arguments over priorities. Fuel allocations, truck routes, depot access, the timing of convoys, these became objects of pressure. Patton's headquarters pushed, demanded, and improvised, because for him, supply was not a background condition. It was the main effort's gatekeeper. This is where his system revealed another form of aggression. A commander can be bold at the front and timid in the rear. Patton was bold in both directions. He insisted that logistics serve tempo, not constrain it. He pressed for more fuel, more trucks, faster delivery, and shorter delays. He wanted bridges repaired immediately, routes cleared immediately, and pipelines advanced as quickly as possible. To Patton, delay in a depot was morally equivalent to delay in a firefight. Both cost lives, both gave the enemy time to recover. German commanders watched and learned something unsettling. The fear was not only of Patton's attacks, it was of his ability to resume motion immediately when supply returned. Many offensives, once paused, lose their rhythm. Units grow cautious. Commanders reassess. The enemy stabilizes. But Patton's pursuit was designed to be restartable, like an engine that can ignite without warming up. If the fuel arrived, he would not spend days rebuilding momentum. He would convert the first available gallons into movement, and movement into pressure. In that sense, the pause itself became ambiguous. It was not clearly good news. It was a period in which uncertainty grew. Where would Patton strike once he could move again? Which road junctions would he target? Which weakened German line would be found first by his reconnaissance? The German staff's brief relief carried a second emotion behind it: apprehension that the next push might come from a direction they had not prepared for, because the longer Patton waited, the more options he could create with a single sudden lunge. This is why Patton in the area remained terrifying even when the area went quiet. A silence could be an absence of fuel, or it could be the gathering of it. A pause did not mean safety. It meant the battlefield was resetting its tension like a drawn wire. And when the engine restarts, it rarely restarts politely. It starts where you least expect, and it starts with the kind of speed that makes yesterday's relief feel like a mistake. In the late summer chase across France, it could seem as if speed itself had become destiny. Roads opened, German formations scattered, and Allied columns learned the intoxicating feeling of movement without resistance. But the continent does not remain open forever. As Patton's Third Army pressed toward Lorraine, the war began to change its texture. Terrain hardened, weather turned. Fortified positions appeared like old bones rising through the soil. The chase met stone. Lorraine was not Normandy. The hedgerows were gone, but the landscape offered its own obstacles: rivers, wooded ridges, and towns whose approaches could be covered by artillery. Metz, in particular, carried a historical weight that was also a tactical reality. It was not simply a city. It was a fortified complex, with old works modernized and integrated into defensive planning. In that region, speed could still matter, but speed alone could not dissolve concrete, minefields, and interlocking fields of fire. The campaign began to grind, and grinding is where momentum goes to be tested. On the macro scale, German commanders felt something they had not felt in weeks: a return of structure. Lines could still hold. Orders could once again refer to a front that behaved like a front, not like a broken ribbon. Defensive planning, so often negated by sudden American thrusts, began to regain relevance. If Patton could be forced into deliberate assaults, perhaps his greatest weapon, tempo, could be neutralized. In the language of staffs, the war became legible again. In the language of exhausted men, it became heavy. Yet in the micro moments of the defense, a different truth revealed itself. A German officer in a bunker listened to American artillery working the landscape with steady method. The concussion traveled through the earth and into the concrete walls, turning the air into a vibrating pressure. The officer had experienced bombardment before, but what struck him now was not merely the violence. It was the continuity. The Americans did not stop attacking simply because the terrain demanded it. They did not give up when speed was denied. They changed method. This was Patton's adaptation, and it mattered as much to German fear as any dash across open roads. When fast movement became impossible, he leaned on coordination, artillery concentration, repeated probing attacks, careful pressure on weak points, and a refusal to accept that a stalled front meant a stalled war. Patton's forces did not always move quickly in Lorraine, but they remained in motion in another sense, always testing, always pressing, always searching for the seam that would turn resistance into retreat. The transformation was subtle but powerful. In a pursuit, the enemy feels hunted. In a siege-like grind, the enemy hopes the hunter becomes tired. Patton made that hope unreliable. His command style could be abrasive, even reckless, but it was also persistent. When speed met stone, he did not simply pause and wait for ideal conditions. He attacked with what he had, sometimes imperfectly, sometimes at a cost, because his deeper belief remained unchanged. Time belonged to the side that acted. German commanders, watching this, found their fear deepening rather than fading. If Patton had been only a fast commander, there would have been comfort in slowing him. Fortifications, weather, and stiff defense would become the antidote. But Lorraine suggested something worse. He was not only fast, he was relentless. He could shift gears. He could keep pressure on a line until the line ceased to be a line, until small collapses accumulated into operational failure. This created a familiar German headquarters problem in a new form. Even when they slowed him, they could not predict when he would accelerate again. A temporary stabilization might last a week, or a day, or only a few hours. The front could feel solid on a map, and then suddenly a crossing would be forced, a junction seized, a unit outflanked. Patton's ability to change tempo, fast when opportunity existed, persistent when it did not, made him difficult to solve as an enemy. You could not rely on one countermeasure. You needed a full answer, and by late 1944, Germany did not have full answers to spare. As autumn bled toward winter, the stakes shifted again. Mud and cold did what German defences alone had not always done. They imposed delays on everyone. The air grew heavier, days shorter, roads slick with rain. In those conditions, both armies began to look ahead. The Germans, pressed and exhausted, searched for a way to reverse the moral direction of the war. They still believed surprise could substitute for strength, that a sudden blow might fracture Allied coordination and create time where time no longer existed. Lorraine and Metz had taught them that Patton could be slowed, but not safely contained. The question was no longer whether he could be stopped at a line. It was whether a line could hold long enough for Germany's final gamble to work. Because winter was approaching, and somewhere behind the German front, planners were preparing an offensive that depended on fog, shock, and Allied disunity. An offensive that, if it succeeded even briefly, might change the tempo of the war. And the Germans had one anxious thought as they prepared it. What would happen if Patton turned speed into something even more dangerous? Rescue. In December 1944, Germany reached for a last kind of power it still possessed: surprise. The winter offensive in the Ardennes was not built on abundance of fuel or superiority of air. It was built on fog, confusion, and shock, the hope that a sudden eruption in a quiet sector could split the Allied front and reopen the war's possibilities. For German planners, the Ardennes offered more than terrain. It offered conditions: short days, poor visibility, forested roads, and weather that grounded aircraft. In those weeks, the sky itself seemed to favor the attacker. When the offensive erupted, it did so with the blunt force of an unexpected disaster. Units that had been holding relatively calm positions suddenly faced concentrated armor and infantry pushing through the mist. Lines buckled where no one expected them to buckle. Communication faltered. Road networks filled with retreating vehicles, civilians, and conflicting orders. The battlefield became a set of isolated fights, small groups holding crossroads, companies defending villages, artillery firing with incomplete information. In that environment, rumor becomes reality, because rumor is often the only thing moving faster than fear. At the macro level, Allied command scrambled for coherence. Headquarters tried to assemble a picture that changed every hour. Reinforcements were redirected. Supply routes were reconsidered. Commanders argued over priorities because priorities, in crisis, are moral decisions as much as military ones: which units to save, which roads to hold, which towns to abandon. The Germans had achieved what they intended in the opening days: a shock to the system. And in the fog of that shock, there was one thought that flickered in German minds like a cautious candle. A German commander, watching the chaos spread, dared to hope. Not because he believed Germany had suddenly become strong again, but because chaos is the one environment where Patton's system might fail. Patton's power depended on tempo, and tempo depended on information, on radio networks, clear routes, and the ability to translate intelligence into movement. In confusion, even the fastest commander can become merely another man waiting for clarity. In a battlefield that behaves like a storm, speed can be misdirected, and misdirection can be fatal. But this was where German assumptions collided with the deeper nature of Patton's speed. They had imagined tempo only as forward thrust, an appetite for attack. They had not fully accounted for speed as reorientation, the ability to change direction, to pivot, to make a crisis into a maneuver. Patton did not merely drive hard when the road was open. He could turn an entire army as if it were a single machine. The pivot north in winter became one of the defining operational movements of the campaign. Patton's Third Army, positioned further south, was reoriented with remarkable speed toward the threatened sector. Roads were cold, often slick, crowded with military traffic. Units moved in conditions that punished mistakes, freezing nights, limited daylight, weather that turned minor mechanical problems into serious ones. Yet the shift happened, and it happened quickly enough to surprise the Germans who believed the Allies would require time to reorganize. In war, time is often the difference between a plan and a rescue. Patton treated time as something to be seized. This movement was not simply a matter of willpower. It required staff work executed like machinery, routes planned, traffic controlled, supply adjusted, units redirected without dissolving into confusion. It demanded that commanders trust intent rather than detailed instruction, because detailed instruction would arrive too late. And it demanded that soldiers move again when many had already been worn down by months of campaign. In Patton's system, speed was a discipline shared across the army, not a mood held by one man. The revelation for German commanders was painful and immediate. Patton's speed was not only offensive, it was the ability to convert surprise into a liability for the attacker. What Germany had designed to fracture Allied cohesion began to meet a force that could restore cohesion by moving faster than the fracture could widen. The crisis did not eliminate Patton's tempo. It gave it a new purpose. Speed became rescue, and rescue became counterattack. For Allied forces caught in the bulge, the arrival of relief was more than tactical assistance. It was psychological oxygen. Encircled men who had been living on limited supplies, who had listened to the Germans promise surrender with loudspeakers and leaflets, felt the war's direction change again. They could hear American artillery growing closer, could see new columns on roads they thought were lost. Relief is not merely the presence of friendly troops. It is the return of a future. For the Germans, that same relief was a blow. Their offensive depended on maintaining momentum long enough to exploit Allied confusion. But now they faced an opponent who could match momentum with momentum, and do it with greater reserves and growing air power as the weather lifted. German plans began to collapse under a tempo they could not control. Every day that Patton's forces pressed north was a day that surprise expired. The offensive, designed to create time for Germany, began to consume time instead. This was the turning point in the meaning of a rumor. Patton in the area no longer meant only that an aggressive thrust might be coming. It meant that the window in which Germany could benefit from confusion was closing. It meant that even a clever plan could be overtaken by movement, and that the advantage of shock had a lifespan measured in hours, not weeks. And as German headquarters tried to salvage the offensive, another problem emerged, more intimate, more desperate than strategy itself. Not simply how to stop Patton's units, but how to make decisions fast enough to survive him. Because once the tempo shifted, the war was no longer about who had the better plan. It was about who could still decide in time. If Patton's tempo was felt most violently at the front, it was understood most clearly in the rooms behind it. German headquarters where war was translated into paper, pins and ringing telephones. These rooms were rarely dramatic in appearance. They were cramped spaces in farmhouses, school buildings or bunkers, lit by shaded lamps and crowded with maps that were always too large for the tables beneath them. The drama came from the sound, phones that did not stop, typewriters clacking, boots moving quickly across wooden floors, and the constant murmur of men trying to turn fragments into a plan. On the walls were estimates, fuel remaining, ammunition expenditures, battalion strengths reduced to columns of numbers. The reports told the same late-war story. Units depleted, vehicles lost, roads compromised, bridges destroyed or threatened. Staff officers tried to make these facts behave, to fit them into a coherent sequence of orders. But under Patton's pressure, facts arrived with a particular cruelty. They arrived too fast, and they expired too quickly. A battalion listed as holding at 0900 might be disengaging by 1100 and scattered by afternoon. Patton's presence forced a brutal choice that German commanders recognized even when they could not admit it. Commit reserves now, or lose them while moving. In a retreat, reserves are meant to stabilize, a fresh unit that can seal a gap or delay pursuit. But reserves are also vulnerable because they must travel, and travel in late-war France and Germany meant exposure to air attack and the friction of damaged roads. If you waited too long to commit them, they arrived after the crisis had moved past them. If you committed them too early, you spent your last strength on a position that might not matter tomorrow. Patton's tempo made that dilemma acute. It turned command judgment into a race against minutes. In one headquarters, a staff officer leaned over the situation map and felt an unfamiliar kind of defeat. Not the defeat of a lost battle, but the defeat of representation. He realized the map was always behind the front, like a shadow chasing its owner. Every marker was a memory, not a fact. The lines were not lines, they were hopes. He moved pins forward, then backward, then sideways, trying to make the picture catch up, but it never did. The battlefield moved first. The map followed, always late, always apologizing. This was more than inconvenience. It changed the psychology of command. When the map cannot be trusted, decisions become guesses. And when decisions become guesses, fear enters not as panic, but as calculation. The knowledge that a wrong guess will not merely fail, it will accelerate failure. In that environment, German commanders began to treat Patton as a meteorological threat. He was not simply a man. He was a condition, like weather you cannot negotiate with, only prepare for. You could not persuade a storm to slow down. You could only try to predict its direction and hope your preparations were not wasted. The fear, in that sense, was rational because it was tied to mechanism. Patton compressed the enemy's decision cycle until it snapped. Observe, orient, decide, act. The sequence every commander depends upon requires time and clarity. Patton attacked both. He forced German observation to occur under pressure, orientation to occur with incomplete information, decisions to be made before confirmation, and actions to be executed while the circumstances that justified them were already changing. The faster the Germans tried to react, the more they risked reacting to something that was no longer true. The results appeared as patterns across the front. Reserves were misallocated, sent to plug gaps that closed themselves or to defend junctions that had already been bypassed. Retreats, once carefully staged, broke into hurried movements as units received conflicting orders: hold, then withdraw, then counterattack, then withdraw again. Defensive lines formed not because a commander chose a favorable terrain feature and built a plan around it, but because exhausted units simply stopped where they could and tried to survive the next hour. Under that kind of pressure, design becomes an afterthought. The front becomes a collection of pressures rather than a coherent strategy. In some cases, German commanders found themselves committing their last reserves not to achieve victory, but to buy time for paperwork, time to evacuate headquarters, time to move supply dumps, time to prevent complete encirclement. This is the late stage of a collapsing campaign, when the purpose of fighting shifts from winning to postponing the consequences of losing. Patton's tempo shortened even that postponement. And the deeper tragedy was that reactive war is a trap. Once Germany was forced into reacting rather than shaping, its strategic options shrank rapidly. Reaction consumes resources without creating new possibilities. It turns reserves into bandages. It turns roads into escape routes. It turns command into a series of emergency measures that never add up to recovery. Against a commander who could keep the pressure constant and accelerate again the moment an opening appeared, Germany's ability to restore control diminished with each decision made too late. By the end of these cycles, the inevitability began to feel less like prophecy and more like arithmetic. An army can endure many defeats if it retains the power to choose its next position. But when an enemy controls your decision time, even survival becomes conditional. And once Germany entered that state, once it was locked into reactive war, there were only two strategic endings left on the horizon, growing larger with every ringing telephone: surrender or annihilation. For German commanders in early 1945, the Rhine was more than a river. It was a psychological wall, wide, cold, and historically loaded, a boundary that seemed to promise at least one final pause in the relentless Allied advance. Rivers have always offered armies a certain kind of hope. Water forces an attacker to concentrate. It exposes bridges. It slows heavy equipment. It creates a natural line behind which a battered force can breathe, reorganize, and pretend, if only for a moment, that the war can be reset into something manageable. In headquarters and field commands, the Rhine was spoken about with a particular tone, the tone reserved for last things. If the enemy could be held at the river, perhaps defences could be reassembled into coherence. Perhaps withdrawals could be staged properly again. Perhaps the interior of Germany could be turned into a fortress of cities, rails, and industry. In the late war, hope often took the shape of geography, and the Rhine was the largest shape left. But hope built on geography assumes the enemy will respect geography. Patton's forces were not designed to respect pauses. They were designed to exploit opportunity, and opportunity does not always announce itself with ceremony. When crossings became possible, through damaged defences, captured bridges, improvised ferrying, or sheer speed of local initiative, Patton's army moved with the same instinct it had shown since France. Do not wait for perfect alignment. Do not turn an opening into a committee. Use it before the enemy can close it. To German planners, the most frightening element was not simply that Americans crossed. It was how quickly the act of crossing turned into something worse. A river line is not defeated the moment troops reach the far bank. It is defeated when the attacker expands the bridgehead faster than the defender can organize a response. That requires tempo. Engineers working under pressure, traffic control, artillery coordination, and relentless movement outward from the crossing point. In other words, it requires the kind of system Patton had spent years demanding. There is a moment recorded in many wars, a moment when a defensive line is revealed to be a story rather than a fact. A German officer, somewhere behind the Rhine defences, heard the report in simple language: "Americans across." It was not a long message. It did not need to be. The meaning was immediate. In his mind, the phrase "holding line" became fantasy. A line can be held when you have time to define it, to position units, to anchor it to terrain, to reinforce weak points. But once the enemy is behind the line becomes a direction, not a barrier. This is the climax's deeper logic. When rivers fail to slow an enemy, the interior becomes a corridor, not a fortress. The geography that once promised defense becomes a network for penetration. Roads and rail lines that were meant to move reserves become avenues for retreat, or routes for the enemy's exploitation. The river is supposed to buy the defender time. When it does not, time is not merely lost, it is inverted. The defender finds himself reacting to threats behind him while still trying to manage threats in front. German commanders feared not only penetration, but contagion. Collapse, at this stage of the war, spread like a condition. A unit hearing that Americans were across the Rhine did not simply worry about its own sector. It worried about its neighbours, its supply routes, its orders, and the credibility of the entire command structure. When an army is already exhausted, bad news does not remain local. It travels along roads and phone lines faster than official confirmations, and it alters behaviour before headquarters can issue guidance. Men begin to withdraw early. Commanders begin to hoard forces. Communications begin to clog with requests, rumours, and urgent contradictions. Patton's true weapon in this sense was not the crossing itself. It was what came after, the immediate exploitation, no pause, no respect for phases. Many armies treat a river crossing as an event to be completed and consolidated before the next stage begins. Patton treated it as the beginning of the next stage, already underway. The moment a bridgehead existed, it was used as a platform for movement, toward junctions, toward towns, toward the next constraint that the enemy hoped would buy time. If the Rhine was supposed to be the last great reset, Patton's method was to deny reset entirely. That denial carried moral weight. A fast breakthrough can shorten suffering by hastening the end of a war. It can also intensify chaos by collapsing structures faster than civilians can move and faster than surrender can be organized. As Patton's forces drove deeper, German command authority weakened not only because units were defeated, but because the future began arriving too quickly for any orderly ending. The closer the Allies came to the heart of Germany, the more war became a matter of dislocation. Refugees on roads, local officials fleeing, soldiers unsure whom to obey, and the simple, devastating truth that the old words of control no longer applied. This is why the name Patton became shorthand for a particular kind of dread. It did not mean merely tanks and artillery. It meant a war that did not allow Germany time to think. It meant that even the last barrier, the one on which so much hope had been hung, could become just another obstacle behind the Americans, another river crossed, another timetable destroyed. And once a barrier becomes a problem in your rear, the next question is no longer whether you can hold. It is whether command still means control at all, or whether surrender will begin not as a decision from above, but as a series of fragments breaking off in every direction. By the spring of 1945, Germany in the West was no longer a single, coherent military problem. It was a fracture. The front did not simply move east, it broke apart as it moved. Units surrendered independently because they could no longer find the authority that was supposed to tell them what surrender meant. Communications failed not only from bombing and disrupted lines, but from the more subtle failure of a system overwhelmed by speed. Command, in many places, became theoretical, something written on paper but no longer experienced in the field. This is what collapse looks like in modern war. The uniforms remain, the ranks remain, the titles remain. But the connective tissue, orders that arrive in time, supply that arrives in sequence, a shared understanding of where the front is and what it means, begins to dissolve. Men stop fighting not always because they are cowards, but because they can no longer see a purpose to dying in the absence of control. In the late war, Germany did not simply lose battles. It lost the ability to decide which battles mattered. On the macro level, Patton's pursuit turned organized retreat into scattered escape attempts. A retreat, when it works, is a deliberate movement, units peeling back, rear guards delaying, staffs coordinating routes, and commanders choosing where to stand next. Under relentless pressure, retreat becomes something else, a series of personal calculations made by officers and soldiers who do not trust the larger picture. Columns move not because they have orders, but because stopping feels more dangerous than moving. Vehicles and men crowd roads not as a formation, but as a stream. Patton's tempo intensified this fragmentation. By refusing to grant the enemy time to reform, he pushed German forces into a constant state of transition, and transition is where armies are most vulnerable. A unit on the march is visible, exposed, and often uncertain of what lies ahead. When it is pursued without pause, it begins to break into parts, some moving, some fighting, some searching for leadership that cannot be located. In that condition, surrender becomes less a formal act than a practical decision. To stop running, to stop improvising, to stop pretending that the next line will be waiting. In a small headquarters, a German commander stood over a stove with a stack of documents. There were orders, reports, names, the paper residue of authority. He fed them into the fire methodically, watching the edges curl and blacken. The stove did not care what was written on them. It turned history into ash with the same efficiency it would have turned scrap wood into heat. In that moment, he understood that the war was not ending in a victory parade or a negotiated pause. It was ending in pieces, one burned page at a time, one isolated surrender at a crossroads, one radio that never answered again. The consequence of fear became unmistakable. Fear accelerates surrender because it alters what men believe their leaders can do. An army can endure hardship if it trusts that command still has options, routes, reserves, a plan that will protect those who obey. When that trust collapses, obedience becomes a gamble. And in 1945, many German soldiers and junior officers stopped believing their leaders could protect them, not from the enemy's fire, but from the chaos of the end. If command could not tell you where to go, could not tell you what to defend, could not tell you what would happen to your family behind you, then surrender became a form of certainty in a world where certainty had disappeared. Patton's relentless pace shortened the war in some sectors, and that mattered. Every day removed from the calendar could mean fewer artillery barrages, fewer towns fought over, fewer men sent into the kind of final battles that have no strategic meaning. But speed also increased the chaos of the ending. Collapse is not tidy. When an army disintegrates quickly, it does not neatly separate soldiers from civilians, military movement from refugee movement, surrender from flight. Roads fill with people who are not part of the same story, but are trapped in the same geography. This is the revelation that sits under the triumph. A fast victory is not a clean victory. Collapse has its own civilian and moral costs. Refugees moved west and east, away from one threat and toward another, carrying what they could on carts and bicycles, sleeping in ditches when roads clogged. Towns changed hands quickly, sometimes too quickly for order to be established before the next movement. Prisoners were captured in large numbers, and the machinery required to process them strained under its own success. The end of a war is not only an ending, it is a mass transition, and transitions are where the vulnerable suffer most. So when historians speak of tempo as a weapon, they are describing something real and measurable. But they are also describing something morally complicated. Speed can end a war sooner. Speed can also make the ending more chaotic, more dislocated, more difficult to control in humane ways. And that leaves a sobering question hanging over the ruined roads and crowded rail lines of late-war Germany. What does it mean to win quickly when the ground is full of refugees and ruined cities, and when the enemy's surrender arrives not as a single act, but as 1,000 separate decisions made in fear? By the time the war in the West was ending, it was tempting to explain German fear of Patton in simple, almost theatrical terms. The swagger, the harsh speeches, the polished helmet, the reputation for relentless attack. But myth is not the same as mechanism. The deeper reason German commanders feared him was not cruelty. It was certainty. Patton created certainty inside a battlefield where Germany had come to depend on ambiguity, ambiguity of intentions, ambiguity of timing, ambiguity of where the next blow would land, ambiguity that could buy an exhausted army one more day to reorganize. German late-war survival depended on margins. A few hours of delay could allow a battalion to cross a bridge before demolition. A single night of darkness could allow a column to move without being broken by air attack. A day of Allied caution could permit a new line to form and a counterattack to be staged, not to win, but to restore coherence. In that world, ambiguity was a resource. It was the fog that hid weakness, the uncertainty that slowed the enemy's decision-making. Patton threatened that resource by moving in ways that made intentions visible through action. There is a small, honest moment that captures this difference. A German staff officer, exhausted and careful, spoke quietly in a headquarters room after another report of American movement. He did not describe the enemy as reckless or lucky. He described them as a system. The Americans move like a system, he admitted, not like an army of improvisations. It was not a compliment offered lightly. It was an observation with a cold implication. A system can be relied upon to behave consistently, and if its purpose is speed, then speed becomes predictable in the one way that matters, predictable as pressure that will not stop. This is where moral psychology enters the story, because speed is not purely tactical. It carries an ethical claim. Patton believed, with some logic, that ending a war sooner could reduce suffering. Every day a front exists, men die, civilians are displaced, shells fall. If speed can compress the war's timeline, then speed can be humane in a grim, statistical way. But war is not only statistics. Speed can also multiply mistakes, wrong turns, misidentified targets, exhausted troops pushed beyond safe limits, decisions made with incomplete information because waiting for completeness feels like surrendering initiative. Patton's leadership was double-edged in precisely this way. He inspired men by making movement feel purposeful. He created a sense that the war was not an endless grind but a directed force, something that could be driven toward an ending. Yet he also pressured those same men, demanding pace from bodies that were not machines. He liberated towns, and those towns often greeted Allied columns with relief that was real and deserved. But the rapid movement that freed them could also leave chaos behind. Roads choked with fleeing civilians, local authorities overwhelmed, the fragile order of daily life disrupted again before it could be rebuilt. To German commanders, none of this softened the fear. In fact, it sharpened it. Because fear is often respect wearing a darker uniform. They respected what they could not counter. They had encountered brave enemies before. Bravery is answerable with fortifications and firepower. What unnerved them was a command style that attacked their most fragile asset, time, and did so with resources Germany could no longer match. In late 1944 and 1945, Germany's ability to recover from surprise was limited not only by fatigue, but by material imbalance. Fewer vehicles, fewer experienced officers, less fuel, and the constant threat from Allied air that punished movement in daylight. Patton's system operated inside that imbalance like a lever. The irony, deep and difficult, was that Germany had once relied on a similar doctrine. Early in the war, rapid movement, combined arms thrusts, relentless exploitation, the refusal to allow the enemy to stabilize, had produced astonishing results. That doctrine did not vanish, it returned. But now it returned against Germany, executed with greater industrial depth, stronger logistics, and the decisive advantage of air supremacy. What Germany had done to others in 1940 and 1941 was being done to Germany in 1944 and 1945, and the symmetry was not comforting. It was humiliating. In that sense, Patton was terrifying because he made the enemy feel the future arriving, not a vague future, not a distant political prediction, but the immediate future of a retreat timetable collapsing, of reserves committed too late, of headquarters moving again because the last headquarters had become unsafe. His presence meant that events would not unfold at a negotiable pace. They would unfold at the pace of an engine with fuel in its lines. The war's final moral accounting cannot pretend that speed is purely good or purely harmful. It must admit the ambiguity. Tempo can shorten wars and sharpen suffering at the same time. But for German commanders tasked with preserving an army that was already crumbling, Patton's tempo offered no ambiguity at all. It offered a verdict delivered in motion, and that is the clearest explanation of their fear. Patton did not merely threaten to defeat them. He made them feel the defeat approaching faster than they could reshape it, like the future itself, arriving too quickly to resist. We return at the end to a room that could have existed almost anywhere along the collapsing front. A German command post in the hedgerow country, low-ceilinged and dim, its windows covered, its table crowded with maps that tried to keep pace with a war that no longer waited. The field telephone sits where it sat before, a blunt instrument of connection, its wire running outward into the earth like a vein. When it rings, it does not ring with drama. It rings with necessity. The voices on the line are still fragments, short reports, broken sentences, hurried breathing. A unit is moving. Another has lost contact. A road is blocked. A bridge is gone. In the pauses between words, men hear what is not said, that no one is entirely sure where the front is anymore, only where it was last reported. This is what a modern army begins to sound like when it is losing its ability to coordinate itself. The war becomes a series of partial truths. Then the rumor enters again, as it did at the beginning. A liaison officer, muddy and careful, steps into the room and says the phrase that changes the air. Patton is in the area. It is not a full sentence. It does not include a grid reference. It does not claim certainty. Yet the room reacts as if the rumor itself has weight. Throats tighten. Pens pause. Someone exhales sharply, as if trying to make room in the lungs for what comes next. Because in the area never meant what it sounded like. It did not mean a single sector, a single axis, a single obvious direction. It meant something more invasive, that your retreat timetable was no longer yours. In late-war German planning, time was the hidden structure holding everything together. How long to hold a village, how long to keep a bridge intact, when to disengage, where to reform, when reserves could arrive. Patton meant that structure was about to be attacked. It meant that the interval between decision and consequence would shrink until it was almost gone. In a small moment that would never appear in official histories, a commander faces the oldest choice in retreat warfare, sharpened into a cruel simplicity. Hold and be shattered. Withdraw and be hunted. Both options lead to loss. The difference is the manner of the loss. Holding risks being enveloped by pressure that does not pause. Withdrawing risks being caught in motion. Columns broken by air attack. Routes cut by sudden thrusts. Units separated from their own artillery and communications. In that moment, command stops being about finding a path to victory and becomes instead about choosing the least destructive way to fail. This is the broader lesson that the war in the West forced onto everyone who studied it. Modern war punishes slow decision-making as ruthlessly as it punishes poor tactics. You can have good doctrine and still be ruined if you cannot act quickly enough to apply it. You can have brave soldiers and still lose if their bravery is spent in isolated pockets while the larger structure collapses. And you can have a plan that is technically sound and still be defeated if the enemy moves through the time your plan requires to exist. Patton understood this, sometimes instinctively, sometimes consciously, and he built a career around exploiting it. His legacy does not need exaggeration. It is complicated enough in truth. Brilliance paired with ego, speed paired with strain, operational audacity paired with a willingness to pressure men and machines to their limits. He accelerated war because he believed acceleration could end it sooner. That belief was not purely selfish and not purely benevolent. It was a logic with consequences, some of them humane, some of them harsh. In the final accounting, the name Patton carried two meanings at once, and that is where the irony becomes quiet and exact. For Allied soldiers and civilians in liberated towns, his reputation could inspire confidence. Confidence that the war might actually move toward an ending, that the enemy would not be allowed to recover. For German commanders, the same name inspired terror, not because they imagined him as a monster, but because they recognized what his method did to their last remaining resource: time. Both reactions were rational. Both were rooted in a correct reading of mechanism. The field telephone rings again. Someone reaches for it. The map lies open, faithful in its details and useless in its timeliness. Outside, aircraft cross the sky with the indifference of machinery. Inside, men feel the future pressing in, not as an idea, but as minutes running out. They didn't fear Patton's tanks as much as they feared what his presence meant. Time was no longer on their side.